Forget New Year, New You. This season is about slowing down, locking the doors, and cozying up at home with the one you really want to do nothing with. Your dog. After the holiday chaos, those quiet nights with a blanket, a podcast, and your pup feel like the reset you actually need. Ollie helps make those moments easier with fresh protein-packed meals made from real human-grade ingredients, so your dog can enjoy some quality comfort food too. Choose from 5 recipes and get a personalized plan for your dog's needs. Meals arrive perfectly proportioned with a scoop and storage container, so serving is fast and mess-free. And with Ollie's in-app on-demand health screenings, supporting your dog is easy, ensuring more cuddles for many years to come. Visit ollie.com/truecrime and use code TRUECRIME for 60% off your first box.
During the trial, the young defendant seated at the defense table could be seen covering his face with one of his hands. Perhaps he knew he was doomed. 19-year-old CJ Rice's defense attorney didn't seem to be helping, but rather sinking his case. His court-appointed defense attorney was Sanjay Weaver, who would later be referred to in news articles as an underpaid and overworked defense attorney. Records would later show that she had been MIA for months. CJ only met with her for less than 30 minutes between his preliminary hearing and the first day of his trial. At trial, she was reportedly unprepared and sometimes confused. She once even called CJ by the wrong name in front of the judge. It was said that she didn't know the crime scene or aggressively cross-examine the witnesses. At 19 years old, CJ Rice was convicted and was ordered to serve a lengthy prison sentence, despite no physical evidence linking him to the crime and a sole witness whose story evolved the more she spoke to police.
I think probably there are hundreds, if not thousands, of CJ Rices in prison right now. Because once you see the depths to which the system failed him, it's hard not to imagine that happens all the time.
So how did CJ get here? This episode starts in Philadelphia as 17-year-old CJ Rice and his friend Tyler Linder were out riding their bikes. It was around 7 p.m. on September 3rd, 2011. CJ would later recall seeing a car he didn't recognize with tinted windows coming up behind them. A hand with a gun stretched out the window. Then gunfire. CJ survived, although he was seriously hurt. He had been shot 3 times. His pelvis was fractured. According to a 2022 story in The Atlantic, he described it as feeling as if the left side of his body had been pinched, then bludgeoned by a crowbar. Why had someone fired on him? CJ thought it was a case of mistaken identity. The police's theory from word on the street later on was that this was a gang-related shooting. Their main suspect was CJ's friend, Khalif Ladson, although nobody, including Khalif, was ever charged. After getting shot, CJ was rushed to the hospital and lay on the operating table where doctors found one of the bullets in his intestines. He suffered complications while recovering and got pneumonia. About 2 weeks after the shooting and 9 days after he was discharged, CJ visited his childhood physician for a follow-up to see how his wounds were healing. It was September 20th, 2011. This neighborhood physician was Dr. Theodore Tapper. At his Philadelphia practice, Dr. Tapper saw lots of patients, up to 15 or 20 every single day. The first time Dr. Tapper's medical group treated CJ was 1 day old. Dr. Tapper then became CJ's regular pediatrician and treated other members of his family too. There wasn't anything memorable about CJ before he had been shot while riding his bike. According to Dr. Tapper, he had always just been another patient, a good kid growing up in a tough neighborhood in a city with the highest murder rate per capita. CJ was bright and had college ambitions. He was scheduled to take the SAT and was in communication with the U.S. Army. But there were also many challenges in his life, living in a poor neighborhood in Philadelphia.
From my reporting, I would say he was a smart kid, made honor roll, wanted to go to Howard University, but also the pull of the street was there. You know, his dad had died. He was being raised by his mom. He was being raised in a very rough part of Philly, dealing drugs at a very young age before he really even was aware of what he was doing. Not a violent kid, but had gotten in trouble with the law a couple times for dealing drugs or possessing drugs.
It was clear to Dr. Tapper that CJ was seriously in pain after getting shot. He could see the long incision down his torso, held together with more than 24 staples from the emergency surgery. Dr. Tapper later said this about CJ at trial. Like many teenagers, especially males, he wasn't terribly willing to describe that he was in a lot of pain. But as I said, getting on the table, getting off the table, walking into the room, walking out of the room, it was obvious to me that he was in pain. Dr. Tapper asked CJ if he was taking the Percocet he had been prescribed. CJ said he wasn't. He didn't like how the drugs made him feel. Dr. Tapper encouraged him to take the painkillers if he needed them. When CJ left, Dr. Tapper noticed that the 17-year-old moved like someone who was elderly. He later testified that CJ was walking with very short, choppy steps and was kind of bent forward like a little old man. He was walking with short, mincing steps. The timing of CJ's visit with Dr. Tapper is important. 5 days later, another crime occurred in Philadelphia that sparked outrage and headlines. A second shooting. This time, 4 people were fired upon outside an apartment. Nobody was seriously injured or died, but a 6-year-old girl who was medically fragile had been one of the victims. Police soon had suspects in that shooting: CJ Rice and CJ's friend, Tyler Linder. But some things didn't add up. One of the victims said the 2 shooters were dressed in hoodies and fired on the group while they were outside on the front stoop. Then they sprinted away into the night. CJ, who was still healing from his injuries, could barely walk at the time, let alone run, thought Dr. Tapper.
He had a physical alibi in the sense that my father, who was his pediatrician, did not believe that CJ could have committed this crime because he could barely walk, much less run. So he had that, and it just so happens that that pediatrician had a son who was so bad at math and science, he couldn't follow him into medicine and ended up being a journalist. And because of that, he was able to have somebody who was able to get the story out there.
You might recognize that voice. That's the voice of CNN's Jake Tapper. In 2022, he wrote The Atlantic's cover story called "This Is Not Justice," detailing the CJ Rice case. And Jake is the son of Dr. Theodore Tapper. In today's episode, we're going to examine CJ's case and what exactly happened that led him to prison, and how he landed where he is today. We spoke with Jake Tapper, who you'll continue to hear throughout this episode and who will help us tell this story. This is Jillian in partnership with Law and Crime. You are listening to Court Junkie, episode 269. Khalif Ladson's mother, Latrice Johnson, sat on the steps outside her mother's home in Philadelphia on September 25, 2011. It was nighttime. Her 7 children were with her at her mother's home, as were Latrice's nieces and nephews. The street lamps were lit, she later recalled. Some of the children were playing basketball across the street. Latrice had spent all day at the hospital because her children's father was battling brain cancer. She was outside waiting for a food delivery that was due to arrive at around 9:30 p.m. Their evening was winding down, and some of the family started heading home. Where was that food? Latrice was buying time. Latrice's son, 17-year-old Khalif, snuggled his 6-year-old cousin, Deneen, who was sick too. Deneen was dying from a brain tumor, and only had a few months to live. The family was trying to love on her as much as they could because she might not even have that much time left. They were hoping that an experimental treatment might save her life if she could get it. Surrounded by family, waiting for food, dealing with the stress of two very sick people in her life, Latrice saw two figures approaching an otherwise empty block. The two figures wore hoodies. I noticed two guys come up out of Fernan Street, and I'm just sitting there the whole time staring at them. And just before I knew it, they started shooting, Latrice later testified. They were walking up here, and they stopped right there. Then they got almost to the curb. They just stopped right there, and they just started shooting. And I was shocked for a minute, I'm just staring at them, staring at his face, and then just something in me, I flipped over onto the younger kids. Latrice blocked the children with her body, getting on top of them to protect them. When the firing stopped, she testified that she looked over and saw one of the hooded figures fleeing up Fernan Street. Latrice later recalled the chaos in a courtroom, saying that her 7-year-old son, quote, had snatched the door open. He kept trying to reach for the door, but he couldn't because the bullets were flying off the walls, bouncing, hitting the walls. He was trying to snatch the door open. When he finally got the door open, everyone piled in the house. So I'm trying to call 911, and I hear all the kids screaming in my ear, screaming. They're all hollering, Deneen is going to die. Deneen is going to die. And I went in the house, and it was just a whole pile of blood right there. I was holding on to Deneen so tight, I'm trying to stop the bleeding from her legs. She had 3 holes in her leg. On the 911 call, Latrice didn't identify the shooters. She simply said they wore hoodies. The police arrived before the ambulance did. It was taking too long, Officer Charles Forrest thought, so he decided to drive 6-year-old Deneen, Latrice, and others in the back of his squad car to the children's hospital. It was there when Latrice realized she was hurt from the shrapnel. Her legs were bleeding. Khalif was injured too. He had been shot in the foot. While Latrice was in the hospital being treated, Officer Forrest interviewed her quickly about what had happened. Who shot her? Again, Latrice didn't identify the shooters by name. The only description she gave was that there were 2 shooters, one black male in a gray hoodie and the other in a black hoodie. Both wore black sweatpants. So she indicated she gave you a physical description of the 2 males. Did she give you a name of either one of the males involved? Assistant District Attorney Eric Stride asked during Officer Forrest's testimony at CJ's and Tyler's trial. No, Officer Forrest replied. But Latrice's story would soon change. According to the police, a confidential informant relayed a tip. A teenager named CJ Rice may have been involved, Jake Tapper wrote in The Atlantic. And soon investigators had a suspected motive. Revenge. Their theory was that Latrice's son Khalif had been the one who had shot CJ while he was on his bike. And then, 22 days later, they believed CJ then ambushed Khalif while he was outside with his family as payback. Latrice spoke with 2 detectives the day after the shooting, and for the first time, she named CJ as one of the shooters. According to The Atlantic, scarce records exist of this interview with detectives, so it's hard to understand how she changed her mind and what the police said to her. But what's known is the end result. During that interview with detectives, Latrice circled CJ's picture out of an 8-photo lineup and ID'd him as the one who shot at them. CJ was not a stranger to her. Latrice knew him from the neighborhood. Her son Khalif was the same age as him, and the 2 boys had gone to school together. Latrice was even Facebook friends with CJ. When CJ and his friend Tyler Linder were named the suspects, CJ turned himself in to police.
He turned himself in. He heard that the police were looking for him about this crime when he was 17. So he turned himself in thinking that, this would be taken care of. They would look at his phone, realize he was in West Philadelphia at the time of the crime in South Philadelphia and he'd be let go. That's not what happened.
CJ's family couldn't afford to make bail, so he remained behind bars. His family also couldn't afford an attorney, so the court eventually appointed Sanjay Weaver. She assured CJ she was coming to the police station, but then reportedly never showed. The case against CJ was a weak one. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime, and the gun was never found. On the stand at his trial, Latrice testified, "I saw the other male, but to me it's a blur. I didn't recognize the other male at all. I recognized a familiar face. That's what I was stuck on. I saw the sparks coming from his hand." "Your focus was on CJ?" the prosecutor asked. "Correct," Latrice said. "Did you say you saw the defendant Rice go down Fernan Street, right?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," Latrice said. "Did you see where the other male went?" Latrice said no. "You told the detectives when you circled this photo array that the defendant was the one who was shooting at you, that you can identify. Is that right?" the prosecutor asked. Latrice said yes. Then, when you circled the photograph, how sure as a percentage were you that the defendant was the man who was shooting at you? Latrice responded, 100%. "Now, those two males, do you recognize either one of those two males here in court today?" Latrice said she did. The prosecutor asked, "And who was the one that you recognized?" Latrice answered, "Charles Rice." CJ. Latrice said, "I could see his whole face, and he had braids hanging right on the side." The prosecutor clarified, "So you could see, just for the record, you showed you could see the whole face. The hoodie was covering his ears and the top of his head?" "Yes," Latrice said. However, to others, Latrice had been less certain who shot her. After his conviction, CJ's legal team later argued, quote, "There was evidence casting further doubt withheld by the Commonwealth. That evidence included the witness's statements to police at the scene that she couldn't identify the perpetrator, statements to nurses at the hospital that she couldn't identify the perpetrator, and statements to doctors at the hospital that she had only heard shots, after which she ran into her house." Latrice also said she was about 20 feet away from the shooter. If CJ's attorney, Sanjay Weaver, had visited the crime scene in person or looked at Google Maps or studied the diagram drawn by police, she would know that Latrice's description of where the shooter came from was impossible. According to federal court records, quote, "The scene diagram also revealed an absence of streetlights near the school and near the corner, where Ms. Johnson claimed the streetlights were located." So that meant the shooters had actually approached in the darkness. CJ's legal team also later argued that there was no way Latrice saw the shooters coming from the southeast corner of Fernan and South 18th Street from her view on the steps, because the police-drawn diagram showed two parked cars blocking that view. Sanjay Weaver either ignored the police sketch, not realizing the important clues it contained, or didn't see it at all. Sanjay also didn't push back and question Latrice's evolving story or the inaccuracies during cross-examination. CJ Rice's attorney, Sanjay Weaver, was in financial trouble in 2011. According to Jake Tapper in The Atlantic, 9 months before her appointment as CJ Rice's lawyer, she had filed for Chapter 13 bankruptcy. On March 16, 2011, Weaver declared that she only had $400 in her two bank accounts. She owed creditors nearly $130,000, not including her mortgage, which she was behind on.
Sanjay Weaver was, I'm sure, a well-meaning, nice woman, and maybe at one point had been a good attorney. I don't know. All I can talk about is her performance in this case. I know that before the trial, she had declared bankruptcy. And I know that CJ's experience with her was that she was not particularly knowledgeable about his crime, not particularly engaged, didn't meet with him very often, only met with him at the detention center a couple times, had stacks and stacks of files with her suggesting that she was probably seeing lots of clients, I should say, because she was bankrupt. She needed money. So she was probably taking lots of cases, lots of court-appointed cases. And then we know also years later that she died of dementia had dementia and died. And beyond that, there is a letter in which she does say to CJ during his appeals process that if he wants to declare ineffective counsel, that won't bother her. So, all of that said, I'm not here to impugn her character. I don't know her. I never met her. If somebody told me she was a wonderful person and a great mom, and I have no reason to doubt any of that. But she provided incredibly ineffective counsel, had money issues, and there's reason to believe that either she was incredibly incompetent or her dementia was setting in early. But there were lots and lots of very simple mistakes that even somebody who's not a lawyer would know. For instance, CJ was arrested when he was 17. Now, you could argue that because this case was so serious, 4 people shot, although none of them were seriously injured, that's automatically not going to not be a juvenile case. But an attorney should at least try, and she didn't even try. She granted motions that no attorney with any sense would grant.
Reading the Atlantic piece, you can almost feel CJ's hopelessness as he tried to reach out to his attorney before his trial started. He was seemingly anxious to defend himself and wanted the tools to do it, but he needed his attorney to help. Whenever he called Sanjay, she wouldn't answer. She had no answering service. They spoke briefly 3 times on the phone during all those months before trial. And in person, it wasn't much better. They met twice at the Philadelphia Industrial Correctional Center where CJ was being held. Each meeting lasted 15 minutes, according to the Atlantic story. CJ had asked her to bring the discovery, the evidence the prosecution was planning to present against him. And when he finally saw her in jail, Sanjay did have stacks of papers with her, but the documents weren't for CJ's case. CJ believed she was cramming in all of her clients at the jail in one day, so those documents must have been meant for others.
CJ's attorney was not a public defender. Public defenders are usually pretty good and usually have resources, maybe not to the resources that prosecutors have, but they have resources. Most people that can't afford attorneys don't get public defenders. Most people who can't afford attorneys get court-appointed attorneys. And all over the country, those people are paid peanuts. Those lawyers are paid peanuts. They're paid by the case. It doesn't matter how long the case lasts, whether it's days, hours, days, months, or years. It doesn't matter. They get, a flat fee, maybe $1,000 or $2,000. And because of that, they're often overworked, underpaid lawyers who, aren't necessarily the best. I mean, I'm sure some of them are amazing, but the incentive structure there is not necessarily, it's for bulk. It's not for quality. So that needs to be changed.
CJ's mother was scared about her son's safety after he had been shot on his bike. And so he was recovering at his godmother, Dina Duncan's house, in another part of the neighborhood on the night Latrice's family was attacked. Dina was like a second mother to CJ. That night, CJ watched a movie and hung out with Dina's 14-year-old son, Gaddafi, at their house. CJ was reportedly in pain, holding a pillow to his abdomen. He couldn't even walk to the bathroom by himself. Gaddafi was his alibi, who could attest to where he was at the time of the shooting. And Dina, although she wasn't home at the time, could attest to what bad physical shape CJ was in earlier that day.
CJ at the time of the shooting was watching some stupid movie called Shotters on Starz pay-per-view with his godmother's son, Gaddafi Malone. And Gaddafi was like a 14, 15-year-old kid. When he turned himself into police, Sanjay Weaver told CJ in 2011, don't say anything to anyone. Well, okay, but that's not horrible advice on its face, but that also meant that CJ wasn't able to tell the police, just go talk to Gaddafi Malone and he'll tell you that I was watching the movie. And as what normally happens is when you prepare for a defense, you have any alibi witnesses go to police and tell their story. So it's at least in the record. And that's what CJ had a co-defendant, by the way, in this shooting, a guy named Tyler Linder, and he had a good attorney, a guy named Ray Driscoll. So Ray had Tyler's alibi witnesses, his mom and his brother, go to the police and, give their statements. Sanjay never told Gaddafi Malone, go to the police and give your statement. We need it on the record. She didn't tell him anything. So, and in fact, she was so unfamiliar with CJ's alibi. She had not only Gaddafi Malone, but Gaddafi Malone's mom, who wasn't at home at the time of the shooting, testify as alibi witnesses. And that made it look as though CJ didn't have an alibi, because the mom, Dina, she testified, and the prosecutor was able to say, well, you weren't even there during the time of the shooting, so you don't even know what you're talking about, basically. And she had to grant that point. And then when Gaddafi testified, because there was no record of him as an alibi witness, the prosecutor was able to say, basically insinuate that Gaddafi was making it all up at the last minute, and none of it was true. So, that kind of incompetence really can have an impact on a jury who thinks, oh, well, Tyler, even though they're being prosecuted as co-defendants and the police theory of the case is that they both did it, this kid clearly wasn't there. But this kid, something's fishy with him. And that's how you end up getting convicted. A source in the DA's office told me they thought the only reason CJ was convicted was because his attorney was so bad.
CJ pushed his attorney to subpoena his cell phone records from Cricket Wireless. He insisted that the records would prove he was at his godmother's home in West Philadelphia. But Sanjay didn't act then, and after his conviction, it became too late. AT&T purchased Cricket Wireless in 2014, and any records with CJ's data were deleted and lost forever, according to The Atlantic. In 2013, CJ's and Tyler's trial began in Philadelphia Common Pleas Court. CJ was 19 years old. It was apparent that the prosecution didn't have any solid proof that Khalif was the one who had shot CJ while on his bike. At a pretrial hearing, a detective couldn't explain who the source was who had told him that Khalif was the shooter. The judge warned against bringing that rumor into CJ's trial. But early in the trial, it was Sanjay who allowed that theory in.
She allowed a retaliation motive to be introduced in court, even though there was no evidence of a retaliation motive. But that was conjecture by the cops, just trying to make a circle fit in a square space, and she granted it.
CJ's legal team said later in court records, quote, "The Commonwealth was unable to provide any evidence to support such a theory. Incredibly and inexplicably, trial counsel then agreed that the jury should be allowed to learn that the Commonwealth considered Khalif Ladson a suspect in the earlier shooting of CJ Rice. Thus, out of thin air, the Commonwealth was gifted a motive theory that helped resolve any concerns that the jury had regarding the weakness of the identification evidence. Trial counsel also made a series of other blunders that undermined her defense." At trial, Sanjay called Dr. Tapper to the stand. "Now, can you describe the nature of the injury that CJ sustained?" Sanjay asked him. Dr. Tapper testified, "He was shot several times. One of the bullets went into his butt. One of the bullets went into his thigh. One of the bullets went into his belly, his abdomen. When he got to Jefferson Hospital emergency room, they assessed the situation fairly quickly, and they took him to the operating room fairly quickly. And they did an exploratory surgery. They opened him up from basically right below his breastbone all the way down to his pelvis, where the incision went straight up and down the body for 10 inches. And using proper surgical technique, stuck their hands in there, trying to find out where the bullet was. And they eventually found it. The bullet had penetrated, had gone into his small intestine, large intestine, stomach. What damage had the bullet done? Fortunately, they found that the bullet had not done any damage to the small intestine or the large intestine. But there was a bullet in there, and they had to grope around in there and move intestines this way and that. And they finally got the bullet, and they took it out, saved it, and then put everything back in place and sewed him up. But they didn't sew him up. They put metal staples in place to close him up. So the staples put the sides of his abdomen together in place so that when the wound healed, it would heal like this rather than like that. Sanjay asked Dr. Tapper, according to the medical records that you reviewed, were there any complications that CJ experienced while in the hospital? Dr. Tapper went into detail. CJ had a lot of pain, but other than the pain that was part of it, he also had pneumonia. He didn't come in with pneumonia, but several days into his hospital stay, from the 3rd to the 11th, he developed pneumonia, and they treated him while he was inpatient with antibiotics. And when he went home, they had him continuing on antibiotics as well as medicine for the pain. Sanjay asked, now, as a result of what you observed on September 20th, 2011, are you able to indicate to this jury whether, in your expert opinion to a medical degree of certainty, whether or not CJ would have been able to run on September 25th, 2011? Dr. Tapper answered, when I saw him, it was 9 days after he left the hospital. The surgery had been done 8 or 9 days before that, so he was still in a fair amount of pain. The amount of pain that I saw him with and the inability to stand and get onto and off the table in my office on the 20th of September makes me very dubious as to whether he could walk standing up straight, let alone run with any degree of speed 5 days after I saw him. On cross-examination, the prosecutor asked him, so in your report, you testified the incision itself would look like it was healing pretty well, with the exception of the area where he had some fluid draining. Is that fair? Dr. Tapper responded, it was healing about as well as I would have hoped it to be healing, given the extent that it was a major incision and that one area had opened up and it was oozing. The sides of the incision were not together, but were kind of gaping apart and was oozing at that point. The prosecutor asked, he had been prescribed a pain medication. It was oxycodone? The pain medication is something called Percocet, and Percocet has two significant components. One is acetaminophen, which is basically Tylenol, and oxycodone, Dr. Tapper testified. And the two of them are combined, and it's called Percocet. So it's not oxycodone only. The doctor asked, and you wouldn't be able to testify as far as how many pills CJ was actually taking? I have no idea, Dr. Tapper responded. I recall that he was trying to not take the Percocet and the ibuprofen, but if he was having enough pain, he should take Percocet, at the very least, Advil, Motrin, or Tylenol, but he was trying not to take it. The prosecutor asked, so it's fair to say that CJ would be able to get up on the examination chair and be able to walk, but your main concern would be that it was that he was in pain. Dr. Tapper agreed. So it's fair to say that his legs worked to the point where he could walk to where he was going to go. It was just that he was in pain? He could walk from point A to point B with a lot of pain and a fair amount of difficulty because of the pain, Dr. Tapper responded. The prosecutor then asked, would it surprise you to find out that CJ was walking the day prior to you seeing him on the 19th of September? Dr. Tapper responded, when I saw him, he was walking. So when I saw him, he was walking on the 20th, I assumed he was walking on the 19th. So no, it would not surprise me that he was walking on the 19th. The prosecutor went on. So, doctor, in your report, which has been marked as D13, the second page indicates that, I will read it. It is my understanding that it is claimed that on the 25th of September 2011, that Mr. Rice was running down the street. Since on September 20th, when I examined him, he had a major surgical incision being held together by metal staples, and that he could not even walk upright, I find this claim extremely unlikely from my medical point of view. The prosecutor stopped reading and asked, that's the conclusion you hold today? Dr. Tapper said yes. So you find it extremely unlikely that he could actually run down the street? I find it extremely unlikely that he would have been running down the street on September 25th or 24th, Dr. Tapper agreed. And your conclusion is because of the amount of pain he would have been in? The prosecutor asked. Dr. Tapper said yes. But you don't know how many Percocets he may have taken on the 24th, 25th, or 26th? I have no way of knowing, Dr. Tapper responded. According to Jake, Sanjay did little to prepare Dr. Tapper or interact with him prior to the trial.
So my dad has testified in trials before, often for the defense or the prosecution when it comes to medical malpractice, if he feels the need. And the way he describes it, every single time he's done it, he's met with the lawyers and prepared for it the way that one would expect, so that the lawyer can ask the best questions, avoid any trouble spots, and make sure that they get the best answers. Sanjay did not make any effort to meet with them until minutes before the trial. And she didn't ask good questions to get the best answers. And also she didn't get the medical records from Jefferson Hospital where CJ had been taken when he'd been shot. And if she had done that, my dad would have been able to say, or an expert witness, because I guess that my dad was more of a fact witness than an expert witness, but somebody would have been able to say that CJ's pelvis had been shattered when he was shot. He wasn't running anywhere. He was barely walking. But the medical records weren't there. And my dad didn't know that at the time. So he testified what he knew, that he didn't think that CJ was capable of walking. And when the prosecutor said, well, what about if he was on Percocets? And my dad said, I don't think he was. And the prosecutor said, well, but you can't guarantee that he wasn't. And I mean, of course he couldn't. It's not like he lived with him. So my dad's testimony ended up being something of a wash, I think, from reading it, because Sanjay was so unprepared to ask him questions about what he knew. But she was like that with everything. She was like that with every witness, completely unprepared. She didn't call the police as witnesses, the police who had been there that night and could have testified that Latrice Johnson did not identify CJ that night. I mean, nothing she did was even barely competent.
CJ Rice was found guilty of 4 counts of attempted murder and other charges. Tyler Linder was acquitted. On May 24, 2013, CJ was in the courtroom for his sentencing. Asking for 7 to 14 years, Sanjay Weaver brought up how much potential he had. She told the judge, "My client has his high school diploma. He actually obtained that within, I think, 6 months of being arrested in the matter. In my review with probation officers who were in the juvenile court system, they all said the same thing. He's an extremely bright individual. They had high hopes for him." Sanjay argued that nobody was killed or seriously injured in the shooting, which is why he deserved a lighter sentence. She said, "The injuries in this case were predominantly gunshot wounds to the legs, the feet, and then some scrap metal that flew as a result, I presume, to the gunfire to the feet. And I believe that the testimony alone, indicating an intent to cause harm to either the lower extremities, is not in and of itself an attempt to cause murder or attempt to murder individuals. As a result of that, I would ask the court to set aside the verdict rendered by the jury with respect to the attempted murder charges. And I know that the court is aware that the aggravated assault still remains, and I have no argument with respect to those charges." The judge denied her motion. Sanjay also said CJ had a supportive and loving family. She said, 15 people or so that are here in support of Mr. Cooper, they include his mother. The judge stopped and corrected her. Sanjay had gotten her client's name wrong. Mr. Rice, the judge corrected. "I'm sorry, did I say the wrong thing?" The judge told her what she had said. Sanjay apologized and tried again. She said, "I'm sorry, they're here in support of Mr. Rice." The judge said, "I know you were just testing me to make sure I was paying attention." "I was, Judge. As always, you passed," Sanjay said. She then brought up the prosecution's alleged motive. She told the judge, "I referred to Mr. Khalif Ladson. The allegation was that he apparently had shot my client. Again, no excuse for firing back. But I suppose, and I thought I'd present to the court, there's a motive. No matter how irrational, it's a little better than no motive at all and firing on people in general. Then it was CJ's turn to address the court, to say anything he wanted before he received his punishment. I'm thinking a million thoughts right now at once. That's why it's hard for me to speak, but I'm tongue-tied right now, CJ told the judge. No doubt, what happened was a senseless crime. So, at the end of the day, we get put through things that make us better in the end. So me being in front of you right now, about to be sentenced, being convicted of this here crime, it's out of our hands. You didn't put me here. I didn't put, you here, he said. The 21 months that I've been incarcerated, I developed a totally new outlook on life. So it's like a couple years from now or many years from now, I probably have the whole world accomplished in my mind. You know what I'm saying? The prosecutor asked the judge for a harsh sentence. Assistant District Attorney Eric Stride said, Judge, I'm asking for 7 to 14 years on each attempted murder. Judge, I understand that's a heavy sentence to give a young man, and he is a young man. I know he was a juvenile when this case happened, but the facts of the case, as Your Honor heard them, and as the jury heard them, were very frightening. The prosecutor said Deneen had been hopefully going to be accepted to St. Jude's for some experimental treatment for that brain cancer. Instead of saving her life, possibly putting her in a position, instead of doing that, she gets shot. She had the gunshot wound to go along with that. And so the opportunity for her to get this treatment, the opportunity for her to try to expand her life goes by the wayside, and she passes away a few months after the shooting. Now, the bullets didn't do that, but certainly played a role in the circumstances and what happened to her. The prosecutor said CJ rolled the dice with the jury. The jury came back and found him guilty of all the charges. And I think they spoke clearly to him, and they spoke clearly to the community. So, Judge, I know that what I'm asking for is substantial, but I think under the circumstances, I do think consecutive sentences on the attempted murder charges are warranted. And that's what I'm asking for, Your Honor. Finally, the judge spoke. He gave a sharp rebuke to the 19-year-old in front of him. Deneen, Latrice, and the rest of the family were simply innocent victims, he said, and it was just an absolute tragedy. So the court takes into account the need to protect the community, which, obviously, given the shooting, is exceptionally grave, as well as your rehabilitative needs. Obviously, you have a lot of talent, as Ms. Weaver said, and you obviously think highly of your own talents. The fact that you feel strongly about your academic drive and the fact that you obviously are talented says a lot too, but also further points out the tragedy of the situation, that you're somebody who had so much you can contribute. And instead, what were you doing? You were shooting women. You were shooting kids. You were selling drugs. It's not the type of conduct that you want to do with the talents that you obviously have. He went on, I'm not expecting you to get up here and express remorse for any crime that was committed because you didn't plead guilty. So I'm not expecting you to now say you are guilty. So the court appreciates that you're a young man. At the same time, you should have known far better. This is the most serious, most heinous offense short of homicide that I can imagine. And yes, as Mr. Stride said, you did prevent a 6-year-old from perhaps having some treatment. Whether it would have made a difference, nobody knows. It reflects the seriousness, the gravity of the offense, as well as your rehabilitative needs. And it's a sentence tempered with mercy, which gives you a chance, after you spend the time in prison, it gives you a chance to come out and to make a lot of yourself. And with that, the judge sentenced him to 30 to 60 years in prison. Good luck, Mr. Rice. Thank you, the judge said, the final words uttered in the sentencing hearing. But that was not the end of the story by any means. In fact, in some ways, that's where our story actually begins.
My dad is a very serious guy, very well-meaning. He went to Dartmouth and Harvard Medical School. He became a pediatrician. He wanted to help low-income people. He moved to Philly. He, I wouldn't call him a radical, but he was very much against the Vietnam War, very much in favor of civil rights. I think he got arrested for blocking Congress in the 60s during the Vietnam War. He testified against Dow Chemical Company during the Vietnam War because of Agent Orange. So visited Vietnam to look at what Agent Orange was doing to Vietnamese kids. So he's very much a money where your mouth is kind of guy.
Over the years, Dr. Theodore Tapper would become an advocate for his former patient, CJ Rice.
CJ went to prison, and in 2016, CJ wrote to my dad and asked him for help to get his Jefferson Hospital medical records. And from that moment on, after my dad saw that his pelvis had been shattered, and they struck up a correspondence, and the letters became very important to both of them. And it became a cause for my dad from 2016 on.
He started working with one of CJ's attorneys, and one day he told Jake about what he was doing.
I started asking him, well, why don't you let me report on this? But the lawyer at the time thought that would hurt CJ's efforts, because the way that judges and people in the legal system are treated, people in commutation or pardons or paroles, everybody tiptoes around them like they're royalty. And lawyers do, because if they don't, they hurt their clients, which is also just something that I find patently offensive as a journalist. The idea that nobody tiptoes around, the president or members of Congress, but somehow the judicial branch is like, oh, no, please don't ever say anything to insult that judge. I mean, it's preposterous. They're not kings and queens in robes. They're people. In some cases, politicians, and in some cases, not particularly good ones. But in any case, the lawyer didn't want me to cover it. But once that appeals process, the official appeals process, was exhausted, I was allowed to write about it. So I started writing about the story in 2020, and I convinced the Atlantic magazine to work with me on it, with an editor and a research assistant. And we started, interviewing CJ in prison via Zoom. And I wanted to go there to interview him, but it was during COVID, so I couldn't go there. So anyway, we did it by Zoom.
Jake, who joked that he was clearly his father's son, started really looking into CJ's case too.
Once I looked into it, I realized that even if you buy that CJ could have committed this crime, which I don't, but even if you say, who knows, maybe he was on the Percocets, et cetera, his representation was so awful, it makes a mockery of the Sixth Amendment's right to counsel. And anyone who reads the trial transcripts can see that. And ultimately, the district attorney of Philadelphia and 3 judges saw that. Everybody's entitled to a fair trial, and part of that is having adequate legal representation, and the system failed him in that. And the way that the system is set up in Pennsylvania, and likely in a lot of other places too, the appeal process is you appeal to the judge who supervised this horrible trial. So, I mean, what are the odds that the judge is going to say, you're right, we screwed up? 0. And then you go to, if you appeal beyond that, you appeal to the judge's colleagues. And what are the odds that they're going to judge that one of their colleagues screwed up? I mean, less than 1%, let's put it that way. And the system just seems to exist to protect itself and not to preserve justice.
The first story Jake wrote was published in The Atlantic in 2020. Dr. Tapper was hoping it would bring some much-needed attention to the case.
I don't know what role it played, but my dad also hired Carl Schwartz to be a habeas attorney. And then from the moment of the story being published, there were basically 2 tracks that my dad and I and various attorneys were working on. Because by then we had the Reform Alliance and the Innocence Project and the Pennsylvania Innocence Project and Carl Schwartz and other people working on this case. And there was a commutation path where we were trying to get him to have the best file possible so we could have his sentence commuted. Because remember, he was sentenced to 30 to 60 years in prison for a crime in which nobody was even seriously injured. 30 to 60 years. Anyway, so the commutation path was going its way and the habeas path was going its way. It seemed more of a Hail Mary, but for whatever reason, Carl succeeded with his, brilliant legal mind, and prosecutors in the DA's office and judges who had open minds and were justice minded. And the habeas was finally granted. And on Monday, CJ was fully exonerated.
In March 2024, Jake Tapper published a follow-up story in The Atlantic with a headline that said, "Finally, justice for CJ Rice." After his conviction, CJ had exhausted his appeals. This time, he had a team of new attorneys, and in 2022, they filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus in federal court. It's worth noting that by this time, Sanjay Weaver had passed away, so no one could question her in court about the job she had done while representing CJ. But Dr. Tapper testified at a hearing and, quote, elaborated on his trial testimony and emphasized that it was virtually impossible for petitioner, CJ Rice, to have run on the night of the crime. Had he done so, his incision would have opened and his intestines would have started coming out. Last year, the federal court overturned CJ's conviction. They ruled that he had been denied his Sixth Amendment right because his trial counsel was so ineffective. The Philadelphia District Attorney's Office then had a decision to make: retry CJ or drop the charges. The DA chose to formally drop the charges.
It was, advocacy journalism, very clear advocacy journalism. I was saying, I don't think he could have done this, and he did not have effective representation. And ultimately, through the efforts of lawyers and my father, he's out. And, I'll never know what effect the article I wrote for The Atlantic had on any of this, but, it didn't hurt.
So CJ, who had been in prison for more than 12 years, was finally a free man and left the prison in Cole Township, Pennsylvania. He was reunited with Dr. Tapper, now in his mid-80s, who gave him a big hug. At 30 years old, CJ Rice is now restarting his life.
He's 30 and he's whip smart and a great guy. But, think about how many things you learned in your 20s. He turned himself in. He heard that the police were looking for him about this crime when he was 17. So he turned himself in thinking that, this would be taken care of. They would look at his phone, realize he was in West Philadelphia at the time of the crime, in South Philadelphia, and he'd be let go. That's not what happened. So he was behind bars from age 17 to age 30. Think about how many basic functions of life you learned in those years. So he now has to get an apartment. He now has to think about credit. He now has to think about a bank account.
We asked Jake how CJ is doing after everything he's gone through.
He is a lot less bitter than I would be. He is a very optimistic and positive person. He is a very impressive guy. He's smart. He's interesting. Look, he had 12 years of his life stolen, so it's not as though he's not distressed about that, but he's not angry. Right now he's just preoccupied with trying to figure out how to build a life. He's got a girlfriend. He is beginning to pursue school and classes to become a paralegal. And he's a great guy. I'm sure I will know him for the rest of my life.
He said CJ wants to go into law for those who don't have the benefit of having a Dr. Tapper in their life.
And just for anybody listening right now, we have a GoFundMe for him. If you just Google CJ Rice and GoFundMe, it pops up. Or you can go to my pinned tweet on at Jake Tapper.
At the time this episode was written in early April, that GoFundMe has raised more than $100,000. Many people left uplifting messages of support on the fundraiser page. One person wrote, CJ, I'm a teacher in Chicago and I always worry about situations like this with my students. I pray that you're able to go to law school. I'm sure we'll hear your name as a leader in the coming years. Sending you prayers of strength. Another person wrote, my wife and I were so moved by your story, we felt it was important to help you with our token. We pray for your success in maintaining your positivity and building your life. Jake Tapper is a veteran journalist who has covered major national and international news. He called reporting on CJ's story one of the most memorable of his career.
It's one of the most important stories I've ever worked on, without question. One of the, top 2 or 3, I would say.
And that's all for this episode. This episode was researched and written by Gabrielle Russon. A very special thank you to Jake Tapper, who helped us tell CJ's story. Please follow him on Twitter or X at Jake Tapper. And as always, I'd love to hear what you think about this case. Join the conversation on Instagram at Court Junkie, on Twitter at CourtJunkiePod, or you can email me at podcast@courtjunkie.com. If you'd like to hear these episodes without the ads or hear additional Court Junkie bonus episodes, you can check out my Patreon options at courtjunkie.com/support. And if you're interested in helping out CJ Rice, I will include the GoFundMe in the show notes. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.